This is Taiwan. This small island nation is filthy rich. When you look past the geopolitics that Taiwan is constantly dragged into and dare to shine the spotlight on its economy, what you get is this.
Taiwan.
Industrial output rose 4.5% in August.
The outlook for Taiwan's economy.
Taiwan has benefited from export, which has benefited the economy as a whole.
Taiwan even emerged as the second fastest growing economy in Asia after Japan.
Taiwan grew its economy by more than 3% last year, growing faster than mainland China for the first time in decades.
Taiwan has become a very rich nation over the past few decades, becoming home to many crucial companies that the world simply cannot exist without. Its economic transformation from being a poor colony to being a powerful rich nation with powerful rich friends is one of the ages, and it deserves proper detailing, something we're going to do today. Throughout this video, we will examine the economic and political history of Taiwan, the reforms it has put into place over the years, and just how it has become richer than China. So buckle up, this is going to be an interesting story about an interesting nation. Do you know what else is interesting? The fact that by pressing the like button, you can help push the reach of this video on the algorithm. So please, take a second to like the video. It would mean a lot to us if the work we do gets to be accessed by more and more people who can learn from it, globally. Right, let's get back to the basics. In order to understand the present state of the nation, we need to start by looking at its past and what it is that paved the way for modern Taiwan to be where it is today. So let's have a crack at it. Looking at the history files, you'll find that very little is known about Taiwan before the 17th century when the Dutch arrived. When these Dutch came to the island nation in around 1622, they found a population mix of mainly the Austronesian Aborigines and a sprinkling of Chinese and Japanese people. The economic structure that existed at the time comprised the Aborigine women practicing subsistence agriculture, while Aborigine men harvested deer for export. As for our handful of Chinese and Japanese people, the Chinese, most of them were merchants and they exported, surprise surprise, deer skins in exchange for salt and other basics. It was a simple economy done at a humble scale, but when the Dutch came, they decided to kick it up a notch. They built a harbor and their first fort in what is now present-day Tainan City, cementing what was already a trading ground as an important economic port. As time went by and the Dutch secured control over Taiwan, they made sure to benefit from the economy. They mostly didn't interfere with the economic ways of the people, but through taxation and new forms of agriculture, they made sure to benefit from the nation. The Tainan Harbor, on the other hand, as expected, grew in importance as an international entrepot. As more people, mostly Chinese, flocked to the bustling Taiwan from nearby shores, the island started growing more rice and sugar, with the latter soon becoming Taiwan's primary export. Even when Koxinga, a Chinese-Japanese sea lord, drove the Dutch off the island in 1661, the nation continued to grow its agriculture bit by bit, with minor changes taking place in the political arena, but economic growth being cemented either way. One thing to note was that all this time, the Chinese population was slowly growing in the nation. This is not surprising given where Taiwan is in reaction to China. Here's a reminder. When the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history, rose, it defeated Koxinga's grandson and took control of Taiwan in 1683. This is when Taiwan was integrated into the Chinese Empire. It will remain a part of the Chinese Empire until it was ceded to Japan in 1895. Some will say it still is part of the Chinese Empire, but we will get into that later on. The Qing government originally saw control of Taiwan as an economic burden that had to be borne in order to keep the island out of the hands of pirates. In the first years of occupation, the Qing government shipped as many Chinese residents as possible back to the mainland, as they saw it as a non-crucial and non-productive area. Yes, the very same Taiwan that now has a higher GDP per capita than China was once viewed by China as useless. Talk about how tables turn. When the Qing dynasty started shipping Chinese people back to China, the island lost over 1/3 of its Chinese population. China viewed Taiwan with such discontent that travel to Taiwan for anyone who wasn't a male migrant worker was made illegal until 1732. This facilitated illegal immigration to China. Putting together the slow but natural increase of the population and the heavy illegal migration of people, the Chinese presence kept growing in Taiwan. Those who were on the island pushed the fold of economic progression in agriculture and entrepreneurial tasks. The original Aboriginal people learned also from these skill sets, and that further drove economic progression on the land. Remember when we said that Taiwan had become a primary sugar producer during the Dutch era? Well, the The nation went on to prosper during a sugar boom in the early 18th century, but afterward, however, its sugar industry struggled. You see, the sugar farms and sugar mills remained in Taiwan's small-scale operations. When they had to compete against foreign production, they came up short, and hence the primary exports suffered. This led to the country becoming poorer, with particular emphasis on the south of the nation, where most of the sugar mills and sugar production had been taking place. Just like every empire and colonizer, the Qing dynasty was not to last forever. However, something happened during the last years of the Qing dynasty's rule in Taiwan that forever changed the landscape of modern global politics. You see, the Qing dynasty made Taiwan a full province of China. That was a claim that for the next decades and in the next decades to come, and still to this modern day, will be a source of contention and massive geopolitics. After having passed through the hands of the Dutch and the Chinese, Taiwan eventually passed through the hands of the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War. Japan's time ruling over Taiwan is particularly memorable because during this period, Japan endeavored to modernize the small island nation. You can say that Taiwan benefited a lot because it was basically Japan's first attempt at colonialism, and they virtually wanted a little Tokyo in Taiwan. When the dust settled, economically speaking, the experiment was a raging success. By the time the Japanese left, it had successfully established order, eradicated disease, built infrastructure, and created a modern economy, the basis of what we have now. In fact, at the peak of its colonial period under Japan, Taiwan was the most advanced place in East Asia outside Japan itself. Japan came with the mindset that they were going to magnify what was already working and then remove all the barriers that existed. To this end, agriculture in Taiwan received a major boost. The policymakers in charge put a lot of emphasis on agriculture, as it was the backbone of Taiwan. Through various policies, they improved rice production with new seeds and farming techniques to the point where there was more than enough internally and exports started again. Although sugarcane continued to be grown mainly on family farms, sugar processing was modernized and sugar once again became Taiwan's leading export, further adding to the development of the economy. As Japan continually modernized Taiwan, large Japanese refiners holding regional monopoly power came to control the industry, pushing it to its limits of development. This, however, did not take the small refineries out of business, but it did mark a period of change and transition. Despite the modernization that Taiwan was going through, Taiwanese sugar remained uncompetitive on the international market. It, however, was sold duty-free within the protected Japanese market, meaning that it always had a market, and it had one at competitive prices. At this time, all the new farming methods introduced by the Japanese also bore dividends, as rice quickly rose to become Taiwan's second major export crop. Under Japanese rule, Taiwan's agricultural output shot up so high that by 1930, almost half of Taiwan's agricultural production was being exported. It wasn't just agriculture that prospered. The whole nation underwent a wave of modernization. Everything that could be developed was developed. The railroads that Taiwan barely had were expanded by a factor of almost 10 times just to propel the nation ahead. With new industries booming everywhere and trade expanding, Taiwan was electrified, which further served to grow said industries. Along with the railway that ran the length of the nation, modern roads and bridges were built. A modern land survey was carried out to better utilize available land and develop it. Large rents were eliminated, and those receiving these rents were compensated with bonds by the Japanese policymakers. To add to all this, several banks were established, and reorganized irrigation districts began borrowing money to make improvements. Since many Japanese soldiers had died of disease, improving the island's sanitation and disease environment was also a top priority, and that was done to perfection. One of the resulting effects of this was that the population size grew quickly because the death rates due to failing health systems had fallen. It is no exaggeration to say that in this period, Taiwan became a bustling hub of glory, second only to Japan itself in the region. This was further cemented by the fact that growth in Taiwan's per capita economic product during this colonial period roughly kept up with that of Japan. The native Taiwanese population's per capita consumption grew about 1% per year, slower than the growth in consumption in Japan, but greater than the growth in China. Better property rights enforcement, population growth, transportation improvements, and protected agricultural markets caused the value of land to increase quickly, but real wage rates increased little. Most Taiwanese farmers did own some land, but since the poor were more dependent on wages, income inequality increased. It wasn't all rosy though. Remember, Taiwan was a colony, so ultimately Japan ran the show, and in running the show over their colony, Japan could be, well, rough. At what was their first crack at colonialism, Japanese policymakers put in place harsh punishment to enforce the law. They basically made sure everyone knew who was running the show, and that the show would run smoothly. Perhaps what is critical to note in Japan's time ruling over Taiwan is the dilemma of colony versus territory. This will come back to play a big role in the future, so let's look at it. Japan struggled over whether to make Taiwan a part of Japan or to allow it to be administratively separate and to some degree self-governing. If they had made Taiwan a part of Japan, things would be very different in the modern age. Global geopolitics would be an entirely different animal. As for whether that would be better or for worse is something that's up for debate. However, the Japanese ultimately didn't assimilate Taiwan. All they did was to force the Japanese language, culture, and heritage on the people. At that point, it felt oppressive, but certain advantages came out of this. For example, it gave them access to science and technology that the Japanese had and a better educational system. These were seeds for economic progress that was to be continued later. Taiwan would go on to also become militarily sound, as during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Taiwan and Japan built several military bases on the island and used them as a base of attack. Eventually, however, Japan lost Taiwan after the Second World War, and the island was rid of the Japanese invaders. Though the Taiwanese people had largely fought together with the Japanese, the island was not entirely devastated post-war as Japan was. The recovery period from the war, however, was slow, and the economy of Taiwan, though not in shambles, was definitely not what it was pre-war. Around this time, things got interesting. In mainland China, war had been raging as the civil war between the nationalists and communists ravaged China. However, as they steadily lost ground to the communist forces of Mao Zedong, Chinese nationalist leaders departed for the island of Taiwan, where they established their new capital. This action marked the beginning of the Two Chinas scenario that left mainland China under communist control and made global politics to this very day a complicated game. The moving of the nationalist encampment to Taiwan, though ending direct military conflict between the two parties in China, marked the beginning of a new age for China. The years following that were hard as Taiwan was experiencing hyperinflation, amongst other things. The island was still also heavily dependent on foreign aid, something which America gladly provided as the world's big brother. But problems in the economy were easy to see and direct to see. On one hand, Taiwan's agricultural economy was left in shambles by the events of the 1940s. What used to be the backbone of the economy was now devastated, with Taiwan now struggling big time. Remember earlier when we said that Japan boosted Taiwan's agricultural markets by making all their goods duty-free? Well, with Japan out of the picture, all those perks went away. Taiwan lost its protected Japanese markets, and the low interest rate formal sector loans to which even tenant farmers had access in the 1930s were no longer available. It was a bad time, and America stepped in to help. With American help, the government implemented a land reform program in a bid to turn the economy around. This program brought some crucial much-needed changes. Firstly, it sold public land to tenant farmers in a bid to empower them. Secondly, it limited rent to 37.5% of the expected harvest and severely restricted the size of individual land holdings, forcing landlords to sell most of their land to the government in exchange for stocks and bonds valued at 2.5 times the land's annual expected harvest. This land was then redistributed. The land reform increased equality among the farm population and strengthened government control of the countryside. Its justice and effect on agricultural investment and productivity are still hotly debated, but at the time the effects were transparent. As Taiwan began to get new wind under its sails, industrialization started to take place. By the last few years of the 1950s, Taiwan had become known for its cheap manufactured exports. These were cheap particularly because they were produced by small enterprises bound together by flexible subcontracting networks. It was the breaking of a new age for Taiwan, as its exports finally became competent on the world stage. This industrialization of Taiwan can mainly be attributed to three crucial factors. These were A, the decline in land per capita, B, the change in export markets, and lastly, C, government policy. You see, between 1940 and 1962, Taiwan's population increased at an annual rate of slightly over 3%. This cut the amount of land per capita in half. Taiwan's agricultural exports have been sold tariff-free at higher than the world market prices in pre-war Japan, while Taiwan's only important pre-war manufactured exports, imitation Panama hats, faced a 25% tariff in the US, their primary market. After the war, agricultural products generally faced the greatest trade barriers. As for government policy, Taiwan went through a period of import substitution policy in the 1950s, followed by the promotion of manufactured exports in the 1960s and 1970s. Subsidies were available for certain manufacturers under both regimes. During the import substitution regime, domestic manufacturers were protected both by tariffs and multiple overvalued exchange rates. Under the later export promotion regime, export processing zones were set up in which privileges were extended to businesses that produced products that would not be sold domestically. All this sounds hectic, but it ushered in something glorious. This period in Taiwan's history has now come to be known globally as the Taiwan Miracle. In a nutshell, the Taiwan Miracle was a period in the late 20th century when Taiwan's economy experienced an unprecedented growth rate, with the country also witnessing rapid industrialization. Taiwan's gross national product recorded an explosive growth of a staggering 360% from 1965 to 1986. Imagine that! Even more impressive was the country's global industrial production output, which grew by 680% in the 1965 to 1986 period. Collectively, the Taiwanese miracle can be attributed to government policy and reform. The government made the business environment flexible, allowing domestic companies to quickly adapt to changes in the international market, in a special brand of capitalism, where the government completely protected the market. The Taiwanese government also focused on importing the latest industrial technologies from foreign countries, an act which accelerated the development of the country. The enabling business environment and political goodwill from the government to support businesses triggered a mass exodus of businesses and firms from mainland China who settled in Taiwan. The movement of businesses also brought with it Chinese business elites and intellectuals to the island, which further aided the development of the land. The country had a mostly uneducated and undereducated population, which was also quite young. And this population offered cheap labor to the domestic companies. Cheap labor meant that Taiwan-based companies had low production costs, resulting in high profits. I mean, who doesn't like cheap labor? There is a dark side to that, but that's a story for another day. As we said a few minutes ago, the United States also played an essential role in the growth of Taiwan during this period and sent to the island nation financial aid amounting to $4 billion between 1945 and 1965. Look, we know you can't send us $4 billion in assistance, but please don't forget to drop a like and maybe comment on the video. Maybe we can have our own Business Basics miracle of 2023. American assistance to Taiwan during this period also came in the form of military and food aid. In education, the country aimed to have its citizens fluent in English, Mandarin, and Taiwanese. Mandarin was seen as necessary since it was the official language in mainland China, while English was selected as the country embraced globalization. Primary education, in which 70% of Taiwanese children had participated under the Japanese, became universal, and students in higher education increased manyfold. Yes, quite the growth and quite the period of improvement for Taiwan. That period ushered it into the modern age of technology and innovation, something Taiwan completely blew out of the park. At present, the super-developed technology and manufacturing sectors in Taiwan's diversified economy are part of what places the island state among the richest countries in Asia. In fact, Taiwan is known as one of the 4 Asian tigers for its high-growth economy. The 4 Asian tigers are the high-growth economies of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Fueled by exports and rapid industrialization, the 4 Asian tigers have consistently maintained high levels of economic growth since the 1960s and have collectively joined the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations. Hong Kong and Singapore are among the most prominent worldwide financial centers, while South Korea and Taiwan are essential hubs for the global manufacturing of automobiles and electronic components, as well as information technology. Speaking of information technology, it's impossible to talk about just how much of a powerhouse Taiwan is now without mentioning that this is one sector that they completely dominated the world in with their semiconductors. We have made a video on this before when we spoke of America punishing China, but there are still a lot of elements we never touched on regarding Taiwan, so let's get into it. As you probably already know, semiconductors are crucial to the technology that powers the modern world. For decades, Taiwan has stood as the world's leading manufacturer of semiconductor chips. Let's dive deeper into the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing industry and examine just how and why it has become indispensable to the world. Most of the microchips that we use come from Taiwan, or at least go through a process in Taiwan. This has become a huge prop for the economy and will remain that way for decades to come. Most of that comes from one root, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's largest and most valuable semiconductor manufacturer. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, more popularly known as the TSMC, is one of the 12 largest companies in the world. At present, it has a market cap of $482.85 billion, but plainly, it's just an economic powerhouse. TSMC was founded by Morris Chang, a Taiwanese American in 1987. Capitalizing off the Taiwanese miracle to try and cement something long-lasting, Morris Chang began a move that now has him referred to by most as the father of semiconductors. During the Taiwanese miracle, a lot of Western companies were outsourcing their manufacturing needs to Asia, and so Chang relocated to Taiwan to capitalize on that prime golden opportunity. After setting everything up, TSMC opened its first fully owned semiconductor fabrication foundry in 1990. This was followed up by the opening of Taiwan's first 8-inch semiconductor fabrication foundry in 1993. The company then proceeded to open a U.S. fab foundry in 1997 and was able to reach a 1 million wafer capacity. Because of its rapid growth and financial excellence, TSMC became the first Taiwanese firm to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. TSMC has been growing at a rapid pace, and all this has served to bless Taiwan's economy. The company has pioneered 7nm and 5nm production processes for semiconductor manufacturing and was the first firm to use extreme ultraviolet lithography in semiconductor fabrication processes. The company has grown so large that it has the estimated global capacity to produce 13,300mm equivalent wafers per year. If you don't understand what that means, let us just say this. That's a huge number. TSMC now has subsidiaries in China, the United States, Singapore, and offices in China, Europe, India, Japan, South Korea, and even the United States. You get what we're putting across. The company has now grown super huge, and with it, a good portion of Taiwan's economy. In the sector of semiconductors, not even China can hold a candle to Taiwan now. The company single-handedly accounts for 55.5% of the global semiconductor market share. On top of TSMC, Taiwan also has several other companies like ASE Technology, AU Optronics, Mediatek, Lite-On Technology, and United Microelectronics. These are all $5 billion plus companies that add to the benefit of Taiwan's economy. Year by year, these companies widen the margin between Taiwan and China, making Taiwan an unstoppable force not only in the region, but in the world. Pound for pound, Taiwan's already richer than China. An easy metric that brings us to this conclusion is GDP per capita, a universal measurement. GDP per capita is a popular metric for the average prosperity and well-being of a country. Unlike some other measures of economic productivity, it takes population size into account, allowing easy comparisons between countries with different sizes. That is why, when we take into consideration economy sizes, GDPs, population sizes, and wealth distribution, per capita income is a more accurate measure of a nation's economic progress. You see, even if a nation may have a high GDP and large population, its residents may not necessarily have high standards of living. This is the case that we see in a lot of countries, including China itself. Using this, we can very clearly and in an unbiased way state that Taiwan is far richer than China. In fact, as of 2022, China's GDP per capita was approximately $12,814. Taiwan's, on the other hand, was almost 3 times as much at $32,756. That makes Taiwan one of the richest Asian countries, far outpacing China so far as GDP per capita is concerned. Don't shoot the messenger, the numbers say so. However, with just GDP in consideration, China takes the cake. As Taiwan's economy grows and the country becomes richer, the more they become less reliant on China. Because of the diplomatic problems between Taiwan and China, Taiwan is slowly making its break from China and its markets. As Taiwan grows in economic strength to someday soon rival China, it is pretty much breaking any big brother, little brother bond. So what are these signs that China and Taiwan are starting to sever bonds? Call it a decoupling as you will. Well, according to Taiwan's Investment Commission, Taiwanese realized investment in China has plummeted from $9 billion in 2017 to just $1.7 billion in 2022. What this simply means is that China's investment in Taiwan has steadily reduced at the same time when other countries' investment in Taiwan has increased. China is now far eclipsed by nations like the US and Netherlands, who have built closer relations with the island nation. Using completed statistics from 2022, you can see that the officially recorded investment data shows that China accounted for 34% of Taiwanese firms' worldwide investment in 2022, followed by 31% of Southeast Asia and India, and 13% of the US and Europe. This is in sharp contrast to a decade ago, when China accounted for over 2/3 of Taiwan's global outward investment. Again, all this reiterates the simple point that Taiwan and China are not growing economically at a consistent rate as was done in the past. What could be causing this problem or situation? Well, according to Taiwan's official survey report in 2022, it was explained that the growing competition from local producers, rising labor costs, and difficulty in developing China's domestic market are the main obstacles for Taiwanese firms doing business in China. Of course, these factors do not exist in a vacuum, and in tandem with other external factors, they all come together to contribute to the decoupling between the two nations. The data also tells us that Taiwan's investors are paying less attention to China and thereby focusing inward. Looking at the 2018 to 2019 pre-pandemic data shows us that Taiwanese investment in China fell by over 50% in that period alone. The timing strongly indicates that changing US trade policies toward China played a significant role in the matter. If you don't remember, that period went something like this.
We'll take you straight to the White House, the President of the United States announcing new trade tariffs against
China.
Trade tensions are flaring up between the U.S. and China.
Trump announcing plans to increase tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods.
I happen to think that tariffs for our country are very powerful. You know, we're the piggy bank that everybody steals from.
Just to recap, between July 2018 and May 2019, Washington delivered 4 rounds of higher tariffs on Chinese goods. This was because of the political dynamics that were taking place between the two administrations. In a bid to not get caught in the crossfire that threatened to hurt them with friendly fire, China-based Taiwanese firms, especially those in the information and communication technology industry, shifted some production and export capacity from China to Taiwan and other developing countries, notably Vietnam. Looking at data from the U.S. International Trade Administration shows us that American imports of computers and electronic products from Taiwan and Vietnam doubled from 2019 to 2022, whereas imports of the same products from China increased by only 10% during that period. Taiwanese firms also largely echoed President Trump's push to invest in the American manufacturing industry. In 2020, their investments in the U.S. rose by 650% to $4.2 billion. The investments continued to grow, amounting to $11 billion in 2022, and making the U.S. Taiwan's third largest outward investment destination after China and Singapore, according to Taiwan's Investment Commission. So as we said before, as Taiwan decouples from China, it moves that much closer to its other allies and directs its efforts inward as well. This has been beneficial to Taiwan, making it much richer. The train of soiled US/China diplomatic relations has continued thematically, and Taiwan always stands as the first to benefit. Taiwan is so valued by its allies, particularly the US, that we have had incidents where US diplomats risk the wrath of China in the backing of Taiwan. Case in point, this.
The Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, is in Taiwan.
The most senior U.S. politician to visit Taiwan in 25 years, Nancy Pelosi, has said America will never abandon the island during a trip that's been condemned as a major provocation by China.
China is accusing the U.S. of playing with fire.
The meeting China did not want to happen. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi defying Beijing's stern warnings.
A torrent of Chinese aircraft, missiles, and ships moved towards Taiwan as soon as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi left the island.
While certain things like the US sanctions on exporting advanced semiconductor chips and equipment to China were a bit of a blow to Taiwanese companies' exports, the island nation's Ministry of Finance has had some interesting news. The figures show that the growth rate of Taiwanese exports of electronic products, including semiconductor chips to China and Hong Kong, has decelerated from 24% in 2020 and 2021 to 11% in 2022, but the growth rates of Taiwan's exports of electronic products to Southeast Asia and India accelerated greatly by 21% and 72% respectively. Quite the compensatory leap. On top of its own direct influence, Taiwan's growth has also had an indirect influence on China's economy. Take this situation for example. Taiwan's export of semiconductor chips to India for the final assembly could grow further after Apple decided to shift iPhone production to India. Apple is a main contributor to Taiwan's exports of semiconductor chips to assemble devices in a third country, and India is expected to account for 50% of iPhone production by 2027, up from 5% at present. That will increase the market for Taiwan and make the country even richer and more solid. But this market is not being created out of thin air. It's being taken from somewhere. Where exactly? Well, China. China's exports will suffer from the loss of its global factory status, and they will suffer a lot. Chinese firms have a particularly strong reliance on importing Taiwanese semiconductor chips, and that'll make them vulnerable during the decoupling of the cross-strait production network. With China's domestic economy suffering from a stagnant real estate market and weak private consumption, dwindling exports will only add hail to the snowstorm. This reduction in economic activity at the same time that Taiwan is soaring shows the reason why day by day, Taiwan is claiming the wealth throne from China. It also seems that somehow, the decoupling from China isn't affecting Taiwan adversely, despite it doing the same to China. Taiwan's overall trade posted positive growth in 2022, while China's exports and imports declined by 10% and 8% respectively. One of the likely outcomes that have been thought to occur from this decoupling is the fact that China might want to retaliate against Taiwan. One of the ways they could likely do this is through the termination of the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. This Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement is a free trade agreement between the governments of the People's Republic of China and Taiwan that aims to reduce tariffs and commercial barriers between the two sides, as well as improve cross-strait relations. However, Taiwan's merchandise exports to China, which benefited from the lower tariffs in ECFA, accounted for only 5% of Taiwan's total exports. As such, the impact of ending ECFA on Taiwan's economy might be restrained. That's a nice way of us saying it really wouldn't be as effective as hoped for. Another method of retaliation unique to China in this case is, well, war. You know we can't entirely conclude the Taiwan/China discussion without talking about, well, war. There is a small chance that China can just try to annex Taiwan, as it already claims that it's part of its territory. We went over this earlier, we're sure you remember. China's President Xi Jinping has even publicly stated that Taiwan should be under no illusion of independence. His exact words this year were, "We should actively oppose the external forces and secessionist activities of Taiwan independence. We should unswervingly advance the cause of national rejuvenation and reunification." As much as China hasn't launched an attack on Taiwan, it would be ignorant to ignore China's provocations for several reasons. China has long since been known to be unpredictable, and to assume President Xi Jinping's actions is a mistake. As Taiwan keeps growing in wealth and power, it's not unfathomable to think that China would want access to the famous semiconductor technology from its renegade province. However, if China invaded Taiwan and TSMC were destroyed, Beijing would face a situation in which it had no significant access to EUV technology, no ability to mass-produce leading-edge semiconductors, and crippling economic sanctions that would cut it off from much of the global economy. It would be a catastrophic situation on all sides. All that said, the actual risk of imminent Chinese military action against Taiwan remains low. Beijing always flexes military muscle when the highest-level US and Taiwanese officials meet face-to-face, as it did with Speaker Pelosi's visit and then Speaker McCarthy's visit to Taiwan. It is much more likely that this stance between Taiwan and China will keep taking place in the shadows, and in the meantime, Taiwan's wealth is only set to grow. Back to the question. Why is Taiwan becoming richer at a faster pace than China? Well, at least when it comes to GDP per capita. A part of the reason is the fact that China is very corrupt, and that erodes national wealth and destabilizes economic structure. Taiwan is corrupt too, as is every country on Earth, but where the Corruption Perceptions Index for the public sector showed 32 points in Taiwan for 2022, China's rating is far worse. China's point score was 55 points. Just for clarity, how the Corruption Perceptions Index works is, the higher the figure, the worse the rate of corruption. So yes, China's rate of corruption is almost 172% worse than Taiwan's. Corruption has eroded China's economy, and it continues to drag the country behind. Don't just think of over-the-counter corruption either. We're talking about corruption that can impose economic damages both directly, such as in cases of tax evasion, money laundering, and other illicit activities, and indirectly by distorting market mechanisms, increasing the cost of business, and discouraging competition. For you to understand this thoroughly, realize that in a 2018 report, the United Nations suggested that corruption across the world costs at least $2.6 trillion, or 5% of the global GDP. The same report also noted that businesses pay more than $1 trillion in bribes every year. You don't need us to tell you how substantial those figures are. For China, one calculation from 2001 pegged the cost of corruption at 14.5% to 14.9% of China's GDP between 1999 and 2001. A more recent estimate from 2010 put the financial cost of corruption for China at 10% of its GDP. That means a tenth of China's annual money is lost in bribes. Yikes. It's no wonder that bribery imposes significant challenges for China. Official government figures show that of the officials arrested in 2018 for corruption, 17 people received bribes of at least $1.47 million, and 5 have taken bribes of $14.7 million or more. In one instance, the vice chairman of the Hebei People's Congress, Yang Chongyong, was found guilty of accepting bribes totaling roughly $30 million in September 2018 and sentenced to life in prison. The corruption and bribery don't just happen at the top level only. No, it's across the board. Bribes have also been shown to find their way into the hands of tax collectors, which has made eliminating tax evasion a challenge for Beijing. According to the World Institute for Development Economics Research, tax evasion costs China $66.8 billion annually. To help root out evaders, China implemented the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Common Reporting Standard that provides Beijing with information on assets stored overseas. It's a good measure, but it's not quite as effective. There's more though. China has also begun targeting the entertainment industry, where fake contracts have been used to evade taxes. In a recent high-profile case, Chinese actress Fan Bingbing and her companies received fines of $127 million in back taxes and penalties. All this is not something that goes unnoticed either. Chinese citizens have consistently ranked corruption among their top concerns in various surveys. The 2013 China General Social Survey, for instance, stated that over 71% of respondents felt corruption was extremely serious or very serious. A 2016 Pew Research Center survey noted that 49% of respondents reported that corrupt officials are a very big problem, significantly higher than other concerns, such as the country's wealth gap and crime. Results from earlier Pew studies show that this concern is persistent, with 50% of respondents in 2012 reporting that corruption is a very big problem. Of course, this is not to say that once you eliminate corruption, China's economy will boom exponentially. No. No one factor can exist in a vacuum, but it is important to note that when you compare the reasons Taiwan is progressing more and less corruption on the island is a contributing factor. So, at the end of the day, where are we with this? Well, for starters, China's meteoric rise that has seen it become this rich is very similar to the Taiwan Miracle that occurred more than 4 decades ago. In actuality, those two events that have produced two giants share numerous characteristics. What China has now, factors like the availability of cheap labor among its population, political goodwill from a stable government, and the non-existence of trade unions, mirror factors that were behind the Taiwan Miracle of the late 20th century. As much as Taiwan is wealthy and is still rising, it's hard to say that Taiwan as a nation is richer than China or that its economy is more powerful. No, China's economy is simply too large for comparison. Today, China's share of global GDP stands at over 18% when adjusted for price differences, the largest of any country. In a way, the rise of China has overshadowed the economic growth of Taiwan, which, like many countries, cannot compete against China in labor-intensive industries due to the diminishing availability of a cheap, educated labor market in Taiwan. Taiwan, however, has found a solution, one created by finding its own niche: information technology. Taiwan, as we have been mentioning, has been investing into this sector heavily. As a result, Taiwan has become a major IT hub in the region, with the presence of Taiwanese technology being felt as far as an American Silicon Valley. In time, Taiwan could rise to the level of China. That time, however, is not now. The chances are there, though, but some things need to be done for Taiwan's success story to be complete. For starters, Taiwan must continue to increase its margin in the semiconductor industry to solidify its position in the global economy. On top of this, Taiwan must diversify its economy so that it has a lot of sectors that are thriving, and so that the economy cannot be drastically shaken by inconsistencies in any one sector. With the aid of trade partners like the US, Taiwan can grow beyond reason and limitations. Taiwan must also become more fully integrated into the international community, including joining the WHO to prepare for the next pandemic and becoming part of the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership to prepare for changes in the global supply chain. Taiwan's path towards a sustainable economic future depends not only on a capable government, a hardworking population, and a more global outlook, but also on the support of the international community. Taiwan cannot resist the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy unless like-minded democracies, which may all eventually face their own versions of Taiwan's China dilemma. As for how Taiwan will continue to develop relative to China, who knows? We suppose, as with all things, time will tell.